The biosurveyor's field log for day 412 contained one anomaly in an otherwise unremarkable entry. Sevkal had followed him again. Achterberg had noted it the way he noted everything: substrate temperature, spore dispersal rate, the juvenile Verk 6-limb gait pattern as she tracked him across the fungal shelf at 0.7 meters per second. He had logged it under observer habituation and moved on. He did not move on now. The escort had arrived at 3:40 local, which meant either the Queen node had been monitoring him in real time or someone had flagged the log. 4 soldiers' carapace plates locked in full extension, bioluminescent threat bands pulsing amber, had entered the field station without knocking. Achterberg had been awake, running spore density counts on his samples, and he had said, with a calm that surprised him in retrospect, "Give me a moment to save my work." They had given him the moment. The throne chamber was not a room designed for human perception. It was built for the Verk Sensorium, a 40-meter dome with walls that breathed, literally, exuding a chemo-signaling mist that carried the Queen's mood in real time. Achterberg had read the xenobiology briefing 3 times before his posting. He knew the mist was running red-spectrum pheromones, which the briefing called aggression priming. He noted his own heart rate, 91 BPM, up from his resting 62, and found himself cataloging the discrepancy with more curiosity than alarm. Was that calm? Or was his prefrontal cortex simply too slow, still writing reassuring captions for an amygdala that had already voted to run? The Queen node was larger than the briefing photos. Most things were. She occupied the chamber's center on a living throne, a symbiont organism that had fused with her lower thorax over what the xenobiologists estimated was 40 years of continuous contact. 14 chemoreceptive filaments extended from her upper carapace in a corona, each one oriented at Achterberg with the precision of targeting instruments. He stopped walking when the escort stopped him, and stood at approximately 4 meters from the nearest filament tip. "You are the one called Achterberg," said the interpreter node. A smaller Verk crouched at the Queen's left, its throat sac translating her subsonic vocalizations into trade language in real time. The translation was always 2 beats behind. You learned to listen for the original first. "Yes," Achterberg said. "My daughter's chemistry carries your signature." He had prepared for a territorial dispute, a resource claim, even an accusation of contamination. He had touched Verk environmental substrates without sterilization protocols twice in 14 months, both times documented. He had not prepared for this sentence, and the part of his brain that handled preparation registered its own failure with a small, quiet lurch. "I wasn't aware that was possible," he said. "I mean, I wasn't aware my chemistry was distinct enough for her too." "You are the only organism of your substrate in a 400-kilometer radius," the Queen said, through the interpreter's 2-beat lag. "Her neural bonding chemistry has restructured around a novel anchor, around you." The filaments extended another 6 centimeters. "I have spent 11 hours constructing hypotheses about this. None of them are satisfactory." Sevkal was at the chamber threshold. Achterberg saw her in his peripheral vision, did not look directly, because looking directly felt, in some way he couldn't immediately justify, like it would make things worse. She was small for a Verk juvenile. Her carapace hadn't fully hardened. She held herself very still in the way she held herself when she was watching his instruments and didn't want him to notice she was watching. He had logged that too: observer habituation, possible resource association behavior. The words felt now like a translation problem. The Queen's first filament touched his wrist. He did not move. "I will read you," she said. "I will determine what you are." He stood very still and let her. The Verk neurochemical literature, what xenobiologists had managed to decode in 30 years of careful, underfunded research, described the unthreading as an interrogation without questions. The filaments were not instruments in any mechanical sense. They were extensions of the queen's own peripheral nervous system, capable of reading surface biochemistry with a resolution that made human lie detection technology look like a mood ring. Cortisol, testosterone, oxytocin, vasopressin. The inflammatory cascade signature of recent injury. The suppression pattern of someone who had taken a sedative in the last 8 hours. Achterberg had not taken a sedative. His cascade was clean. The queen had expected predatory chemistry. She had a framework for call theft. 3 documented species had attempted to suborn Verk juveniles for various resource and territorial advantages over the colony's recorded history. The signature was consistent. Elevated baseline testosterone, suppressed oxytocin, a cortisol profile that spiked and recovered in the pattern associated with controlled deception. The organisms ran hot with purpose. They always did. Achterberg was not running hot with purpose. He was running, the queen parsed this slowly, filaments resampling, a grief profile. Prolactin elevated. Cortisol present but not spiking. Something in the vasopressin banding that her own neurochemistry produced during colony loss events. He was not mourning anyone she could identify. He did not appear to know he was doing it. His face was doing the thing human faces did when they were attempting to appear calm, slight jaw tension, artificially steady breathing, but the chemistry underneath was unambiguous. This organism was in distress about something. The distress was not about its current situation, because fear had a different signature and she could read fear with her filaments closed. She pulled the 3rd filament back and redirected it toward his temple, where the capillary density was highest. "You have not threatened me," she said, through the interpreter. "I want you to understand that I expected you to." "I'm not going to threaten you," Achterberg said. "No, your chemistry confirms this." She paused. "It is confusing." He almost smiled. She registered the micromuscular movement, a 0.3-second upward pull at the lateral mouth corners, and filed it under expressions she did not yet have a category for. "I imagine it is," he said. Then, and this was the moment her entire model reorganized itself around, the anomaly that cascaded backward and forward through her hypotheses and left them all standing at wrong angles, he said. "Is Sevkal okay? I mean, has she been eating? I noticed last week her sample carrying decreased by about 30%, and I wasn't sure if that was." The queen stopped the unthreading. All 14 filaments retracted. The chamber was silent. He had asked about her daughter. Not as deflection, she would have read deflection. It had a signature like everything else, a particular cortisol arrangement that accompanied the construction of strategic language. He had asked the way her own colony members asked about each other after a toxic event. The same vasopressin spike, the same pupil dilation, the same breath pattern that preceded genuine waiting for an answer. In the queen's taxonomy, built over an evolutionary history that had never needed a category for this, concern for a non-kin juvenile of a foreign substrate was not a behavior. It was not a failure mode of a behavior. It was a structural absence in the model. A shape she had not known was missing until this organism's chemistry carved it out of the air. She was aware that her threat display had been offline for 40 seconds. She was aware that her daughter at the threshold was making a sound the queen had never heard her make before. A subsonic hum in the filial recognition register, directed not at the queen, but at the human standing 4 meters away with his prolactin elevated, and his hands steady, and his face trying to look like he wasn't waiting for an answer about whether a Verk juvenile he had no biological reason to care about was eating enough. The queen said, in trade language, slowly, a question she had spent 40 years of colony rule and never once needed to ask. "What are you to her?" 11 seconds. The queen counted them. No Verk hesitated on questions of bond category. Category was biology. Biology was immediate. You knew what you were to another organism the way you knew your own carapace. It was not a question you calculated. It was a thing you were. The human stood there for 11 seconds and calculated. He stopped, started again. I've been here for 14 months. She started following me on the third survey. I thought it was territorial, monitoring an intruder. Then I thought it was resource curiosity because she kept looking at my instruments. And then she started bringing me things. Things, the Queen repeated. Fungal nodes, cracked mineral samples. Once I think it was a deceased soil processor. She seemed very pleased with it. His voice had changed. The clinical register was still there, but something underneath it had shifted. Warmed was not quite the right word, but the Queen had no better one in trade language. I started leaving data slates at her observation ledge. She couldn't read them, but she'd pick them up and look at them and then look at me and I. He stopped again. The Queen waited. I started looking forward to it, he said. The surveys. I told myself it was because the data collection was going well, but, a pause, his cortisol spiked once and settled. I think I was looking forward to seeing her. The Queen processed this. She had been processing it since his first sentence, the unthreading still running at low level through the contact her filaments maintained with the mist-saturated air around him. His chemistry was not lying. His chemistry was doing something stranger. It was showing her that he had been lying to himself. For months, constructing professional labels for a process that was not professional, and that the labels had just failed for the first time in this chamber, and he was looking at what was underneath them with the same expression her sensors associated with a colony member, confronting a bad sample reading. He had called it field rapport. The label had fit until it hadn't, and now he was standing here without one. The Queen thought about predation. She thought about symbiosis, commensalism, parasitism, the 47 bond categories her species had documented across their 2,000-year recorded history. She thought about call theft and resource fixation and trauma bonding, and every other mechanism by which a juvenile's loyalty could be misdirected. None of them fit. What this human had done, she turned it over in the unthreading, reading it from every biochemical angle, was extend recognition. He had looked at her daughter, a six-limbed organism of foreign substrate with a sensory architecture he could barely model, and something in his neural processing had said, this one. He had built a relational structure around Sevcal with no survival utility, no reproductive logic, no kin selection justification. Not even the extended kin selection some social species applied to members of their own group. He had done it anyway. He had kept doing it, past the point where his own labels made sense, past the point where the professional vocabulary fit, and he had not stopped even now, under interrogation, with 14 chemoreceptive filaments reading him for threat and the ambient pheromone mist running full aggression prime. His primary concern, right now, the Queen could read it in the prolactin, in the vasopressin, in the micro-expressions he was not controlling because he was focused on the words, was not his own survival. It was whether Sevcal was going to be confused by his absence if this ended badly. The Queen was silent for a long time. She had categories for what threatened her colony. She had categories for what served it. She had spent 40 years building and refining those categories because a Queen node who could not categorize was a Queen node who could not protect. She did not have a category for this. She built one. It took her approximately 90 seconds. She was aware this was visible, that the human was watching her filaments move through the mist chemistry of the chamber and reading the pause as something, probably threat. And when she was done, the category had no Verk name because it had never needed one. She assigned it a temporary marker in her own mental architecture. The closest trade language approximation, she decided, was bond formed without reason, maintained without benefit, present under conditions that should have ended it. Come here, she said to her daughter. Sevcal crossed the chamber. She was not looking at the Queen. She was looking at Ichterberg with the expression the Queen had been seeing on her face for, she calculated backward through her own memory, pulling observation logs she had not flagged as significant at the time, 4 months, at minimum. Sevcal reached up with 3 of her 6 limbs and gripped Ichterberg's left forearm. The filial recognition gesture, the one the queen had performed for her daughter twice a day since Sevcal's carapace was still soft and the colony was still learning her chemistry. Ichterberg went very still. His eyes moved to the queen's, and his chemistry produced a spike the queen had not seen before and had to analyze twice to confirm. It was relief, but the object of the relief was not his own survival. It was her daughter. The queen's threat display had been offline for 6 minutes. She recorded this in her personal log, which the xenosociology team would recover 11 months later when they arrived to conduct the first formal Werk diplomatic survey. They would find the entry in the Bond classification archive, appended to a new category header. Organism demonstrated bond formation with non-kin juvenile of foreign substrate. No reproductive advantage confirmed. No resource advantage confirmed. No survival advantage confirmed. Bond persisted under direct threat assessment interrogation. Organism's primary concern at peak threat level was juvenile well-being, not personal survival. Organism was not aware, at time of formation, that bond had formed, demonstrated by 11-second hesitation when asked to classify it, and by prior use of inadequate professional terminology as a cognitive buffer. The bond is real by every chemical measure available. We do not have a word for what produces this in them. We do not have a word for what it means that they do not have a word for it either. Threat assessment unresolved. The provisional bond status record for biosurveyor Ichterberg remained the only entry in the new category for 7 years, until the xenosociology team added a second, and a third, and eventually stopped counting. Sevcal held his forearm for 4 minutes and 22 seconds. Ichterberg did not move. His cortisol dropped 16 points and kept dropping. The queen watched.